The brickwork in the Lower East Side of Manhattan does not match the blueprints filed in the city archives of 1892. I stood there under a freezing drizzle, tracing the mortar lines of a foundation that shouldn't exist. It was a small thing, a minor deviation in the load distribution of a standard tenement basement. But the math was wrong. The stone was too old. The geometry was too precise for a period defined by hurried immigrant labour and cheap materials. It wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a basement. It was a physical contradiction. Ask yourself why a municipal record would list red clay when the reality is dressed granite. Ask yourself why the depth of the foundation extends 40 feet below the supposed bedrock. I found the first discrepancy in a discarded ledger from a firm that vanished in the panic of 1907. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was frantic. It spoke of reclaiming rather than building. It spoke of unearthing the arches rather than erecting them. Not a construction project, not a renovation, an excavation of something already there. I looked at the surrounding skyline and realised I wasn't looking at a young city. I was looking at a capped one. The anomalies started appearing everywhere once I knew the pattern to look for. Mud-stained windows half buried in the soil of every major capital, grand cathedrals with atmospheric electricity collectors rebranded as decorative spires. We are told these were the products of horse and buggy eras, yet we cannot replicate the resonance of their stone today. What if the history we are taught is a narrative of managed decline? What if the great fires of the 19th century, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, were not accidents, but controlled demolitions of a previous civilization's infrastructure? I found a letter. It was tucked into the binding of a 19th century geography textbook that had been flagged for destruction by a university library. It was addressed to a man named Elias Thorne, a surveyor who disappeared in 1888. The letter was short. It was brutal. It told him to burn his findings. It told him that the maps of the North were not empty because of ice, but because of an agreement. It mentioned a name that has been scrubbed from every modern digital database. Tartaria. Not a myth. Not a nomad's ghost. A global power erased by a systematic institutional gatekeeping that spans centuries. The silence of the archives is louder than any scream. When I approached the curator at the National Geographic Society, his eyes didn't widen with surprise. They narrowed with a very specific kind of weariness. He knew. He simply didn't want the paperwork of a revelation. This is how the erasure works. Not through book burnings in the streets, but through the quiet decommissioning of files, through the reclassification of maps, through the subtle shift in academic consensus that makes an entire empire seem like a cartographic error. I travelled to the salt flats, where the earth is flat enough to see the curvature of the lie. I looked for the ruins that aren't called ruins. We call them natural formations. We call them geological curiosities. But nature does not build in right angles. Nature does not leave behind iron rebar inside prehistoric columns. The pattern began to expand. It wasn't just New York. It was London. It was St. Petersburg. It was Tokyo. A global architectural signature, uniform and magnificent, that predates the colonial borders we fight over today. Consider the world's fairs. The White City of Chicago in 1893. They told us it was built of plaster and wood in mere months, only to be burned down when the fair ended. Ask yourself the logic of that. Why build a Greco-Roman wonderland of immense scale and technological sophistication just to destroy it, unless it wasn't built for the fair, unless the fair was a funeral, a way to let the public see the wonders of the old world one last time before they were cleared away for the modern grid. Not progress, not innovation, a clearing of the board. The narrative tells us we rose from the dirt, but the stones tell us we fell from the stars. I spent nights in the basement of the New York Public Library, tracing the lineages of the families who funded the historical societies, the same names, the same trusts, the same architects who discovered the foundations and built their reputations on top of them. They are the keepers of the timeline. They are the ones who decided when history began and where it had to end. The letter Thorne was told to burn mentioned a great reset. It wasn't a modern political buzzword. It was a historical technique, a periodic wiping of the collective memory to ensure that the occupants of the ruins never realize they are living in a graveyard of giants. I followed the trail to the outskirts of San Francisco, to the ruins of the Sutro Baths. The official story is one of Victorian ambition and eventual decay, but look at the stone. Look at the way it integrates with the coastline. This wasn't a bathhouse. It was a water processing plant for a city that functioned on a different frequency. The energy wasn't chemical, it was etheric. I spoke to an old man in a coastal tavern who claimed his grandfather was part of the cleanup crews in 1906. He didn't talk about earthquakes. He talked about the ships that sat offshore, firing into the city to bring down the domes that wouldn't fall. Not a disaster, not a tragedy, an assault. He described the removal of the free energy devices from the tops of the buildings, gold-leafed resonators that provided heat and light to the entire district without a single wire. After the fire, they replaced them with coal and copper. They sold us the wires. They sold us the scarcity. What if the poverty of the 20th century was an engineered product? What if the struggle for resources is a fiction designed to keep us from looking up at the sky and wondering why the stars look like the patterns in the old cathedrals? I moved my search to the desert, where the sand hides the cities that the maps forgot. In the 17th century maps, the interior of the American West isn't a desert. It's a kingdom. It's a network of walled cities and lush rivers. We are told the mappers were just guessing. We are told they were imaginative. But why were they all imagining the same thing? Why did the maps of the 1800s suddenly go blank, replaced by terra incognita in places that were previously teeming with life? It is the erasure trope in its purest form. If you remove the city from the map, you remove the people from history. If you remove the people, you can claim the land as discovered. It is the ultimate heist, the theft of a continent's past to justify its present ownership. I found a piece of fused glass in the Nevada sand that shouldn't be there. It wasn't from a nuclear test. It was older. It was weathered by 1,000 years of wind, yet it held the signature of a high-energy discharge, the kind of discharge you get when a power grid fails, or when it's overloaded by a weapon. In the archives of the Vatican, there are sections where the air is kept so thin that a human can only stay for 20 minutes without supplemental oxygen. I didn't get in, of course. No one does. But I met a man who had been a digital archivist for the Holy See during the 2021 transition. He spoke of the Tartaria protocols. He spoke of the thousands of scrolls that described a world where the East and West were not divided, where a single language of symbols allowed for the transfer of knowledge across oceans in days, not months. The technology was based on resonance, on the understanding that the earth itself is a vibrating body. Not this science, not that science, a different science entirely. He told me about the silent war of the 1840s, a war that doesn't appear in the textbooks, a war fought with frequencies and floods. The mud flood isn't a metaphor. It was a geological event triggered by the misuse of these resonance technologies, or perhaps it was a deliberate cleansing, a way to bury the lower levels of the old world cities, turning the grand entrances into basements and the streets into mass graves. Ask yourself why every major city in the world has a sunken first floor, why the windows peek out from the sidewalk, why we have subways that look like palatial hallways. They weren't built as tunnels, they were the original streets. We are walking on the roofs of our ancestors' world. The investigator in me wanted to scream, but the scholar in me had to find the proof. I went to the old mines in the Urals. I found the shafts that weren't dug by tools. They were melted into the rock. The walls were smooth as glass. This is the industrial erasure. They take the old mines, the old factories, the old power plants, and they tell us they are natural caves or abandoned quarries. They hide the evidence in plain sight because they know we have been trained to see only what we are told to see. The letter to Thorne mentioned the order of the compass. It wasn't a secret society of men in robes. It was a guild of architects and historians whose sole job was to rebuild the world in a way that hid its true origins. They were the ones who designed the colonial style, a simplified, weakened version of the old world grandeur, a style that said, "We are new, we are small, we are just beginning." The patterns of the stars used to be different. This is the most provocative part of the Thorne papers. He wasn't just surveying the land, he was surveying the heavens. He noted that the star charts from the 16th century didn't just have different names, they had different positions. He theorized that the earth had shifted, or perhaps the firmament itself had been altered. Not a cosmic accident, not a natural drift, a technical adjustment. What if the great reset involved a change in the very environment we live in? What if the reason we can't use the old free energy devices is that the medium they operated in, the ether, was fundamentally changed? I found a series of photographs from the 1850s in a private collection in Paris. They were daguerreotypes of Moscow, London, and New York. The streets were empty, not a soul, not a horse, not a bird. The exposure times were long, yes, but not long enough to erase a bustling city. The cities were empty because they were being reset. The population had been removed. Where did they go? The orphan trains. Ask yourself why, in the mid-19th century, there were suddenly hundreds of thousands of orphans being shipped across the world in trains. Where did they come from? Why was there no record of their parents? Why were they used to repopulate the empty cities of the American West? They were the blank slates, the new citizens of a new history. They were taught that they were the survivors of a harsh frontier, when in reality they were the inheritors of a stolen kingdom. They were given the simplified language. They were given the simplified religion. They were given the simplified science. The institutional gatekeeping began with the schools. The creation of the modern education system was the final nail in the coffin of Tartaria. It was designed to produce workers who could follow instructions, but who would never look at a Greco-Roman post office in Iowa and ask, who really built this? The architecture is a silent witness, but the education system is a loud liar. The staccato rhythm of the modern world, the 9 to 5, the constant noise, the digital distraction, is designed to prevent the quiet required to hear the stones. I spent a month in the Himalayan foothills looking for the white pyramids that the pilots saw during World War II. The government says they are just mountains. The locals say they are the tombs of the kings of the north. But when you look at them through infrared, they aren't stone. They are metal, or rather, they are stone infused with metal. They are antennas. The global pattern is a circuit. Every pyramid, every cathedral, every obelisk is a component in a planetary machine that has been deactivated. I found a technical manual in a flea market in Berlin, dated 1812. It was written in a script that looked like Cyrillic but had the mathematical structure of Sanskrit. It described the harmonization of the spheres. It wasn't music, it was power distribution. It explained how to use the magnetic field of the earth to provide limitless energy to every home. Not this fuel, not that fuel, no fuel at all. The erasure of this knowledge was a violent act. The wars of the 19th century, the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the Civil War, were not about ideology. They were about the destruction of the energy hubs. They were about the dismantling of the etheric grid. Every time a city was liberated, the first thing they did was tear down the spires. The first thing they did was replace the old. Copper domes with lead. The letter from Tartaria that Thorne was told to burn contained a map of the hubs. It showed a network that spanned from the Gobi Desert to the Mississippi Valley. It showed a world without borders, held together by a common frequency. The skeptical of authority stance isn't just a mood, it's a necessity for survival. Because the authority isn't just lying about the present, it has stolen the past. It has replaced our majestic ancestry with a story of primitive struggle. It has made us feel like lucky survivors rather than dispossessed heirs. The somber reality is that we are living in the ruins of a golden age, and we are being told it's the pinnacle of human achievement. The more I dig, the more the institutional gatekeeping becomes physical. I've been followed in 3 different cities. My digital files have been corrupted by errors that shouldn't happen on an air-gapped drive. There is a load distribution of power that we don't see. The politicians and CEOs are the facade, but the architects of the timeline are the ones who stay in the shadows. I found a reference to a group called the Kronos Bureau in a document from the Smithsonian that was accidentally leaked during a server migration. Their job is temporal stabilization. In plain English, making sure the past stays dead. They are the ones who plant the anomalous artifacts to be debunked. They are the ones who fund the archaeological digs that always seem to find exactly what the textbooks say they should find. Ask yourself why it is illegal to explore the Grand Canyon without a permit. Why are there areas labelled as danger, radioactive, or environmentally sensitive that just happen to contain Egyptian-style caves? I've seen the photos that the hikers took before their cameras were confiscated. I've seen the statues of kings that don't belong in the Americas. The erasure is not just of a name, but of a connection. If we knew that we were once a global civilization, we would realize that the current divisions are artificial. We would realize that the scarcity we are sold is a lie. The intellectually provocative question is this: if they can hide an entire empire, what else are they hiding? If the history of the last 300 years is a fabrication, what about the last 3,000? I sat in a small chapel in rural France, looking at a stained glass window that seemed to depict a flying craft, not a bird, not a cloud, a structured, metallic craft. The priest saw me looking. He didn't tell me it was a miracle. He didn't tell me it was a vision. He whispered, "It's a memory." The staccato rhythm of the investigation led me to the edge of the Arctic Circle. The old maps show a continent there, not ice, not a void, a landmass with 4 rivers flowing from a central mountain. Mercator's map of 1595 shows it clearly. We are told he was confused. We are told he was using mythological sources. But Mercator was the most accurate cartographer of his time. He didn't guess. He copied from older sources that have since disappeared. I found a logbook from a whaling ship in 1842 that described a city of glass visible through the fog near the 81st parallels. The crew wanted to investigate, but the captain, a member of the same Order of the Compass I'd found in Thorne's papers, refused to change course. He told them it was a mirage. He told them the cold was playing tricks on their eyes, but the logbook says the compasses stopped spinning. It says the air became warm. It says the water was as still as a mirror. This is the etheric dead zone, the place where the old world's heart still beats, protected by a wall of frequency we cannot penetrate. The urban exploration of our own history is a dangerous game because it leads to the realization that we are the ones who are lost. We are the ones living in the terra incognita. The world outside our reset bubble is vast and full of life, but we are confined to this narrow corridor of time. The letter to Thorne ended with a warning: do not seek the north. The ice is not a climate, it is a curtain. What if the global warming we are told to fear is actually a global thawing? What if the ice is melting because the curtain is failing? What if the reason the authorities are so frantic to control the narrative now is that the ruins are starting to reappear? The mud is drying, the water is receding, the secrets are coming to the surface, and no amount of institutional erasure can stop the earth from revealing its true face. The tension in the air is palpable now. Every time I publish a fragment, the pushback gets stronger. The pseudo-academic debunkers are out in force, using their technical terms to explain away the impossible. They talk about capillary action to explain why there's water in the 50th floor basements of skyscrapers. They talk about architectural revivalism to explain why every post office in the Midwest looks like a temple to a forgotten god, but they never explain the why. Why the scale? Why the cost? Why the silence? I found a grave in a small cemetery in upstate New York. It had no name, only a symbol, a compass and a broken spire. I think it's Elias Thorne. I think he didn't burn the letter. I think he tried to tell the world, and this was his reward, an anonymous grave in a town that doesn't remember him. I stood there for a long time, wondering if I was following in his footsteps, if this investigation was a search for truth or a suicide note. The mysterious and unsettling part isn't the ghost of Tartaria, it's the living presence of its killers. They are still here. They are the ones who run the banks, the universities, the media. They are the ones who ensure that the load distribution of knowledge remains uneven. They want us to be modern. They want us to be progressive. Because as long as we are looking forward, we aren't looking down. We aren't seeing the bones of the giants we are standing on. I took a piece of the red brick from a demolished building in Brooklyn, a building that supposedly dated to 1920 but had the same reclaimed granite foundation as the ones from 1892. I had it tested. The mineral composition wasn't from any local quarry, it was from a range in the Gobi Desert. How did 19th century builders transport millions of tons of stone from the interior of Asia to the coast of America? They didn't. The stone was already here. The building was already here. We just put a new roof on it and called it ours. The final part of the Thorne papers wasn't a map or a letter. It was a philosophical meditation. He wrote about the nature of time. He wrote that time isn't a line, but a series of rooms. We have been locked in one room, and the door to the next has been barred. The Tartaria we seek isn't just a place, it's a state of being. It was a time when humanity was in harmony with the laws of the universe, rather than trying to break them for profit. The unresolved philosophical open loop is this. If we found the key, would we even know how to use it? If the free energy were returned to us tomorrow, would we build a paradise, Or would we just find a new way to kill each other? Perhaps the reset wasn't an act of malice, but an act of mercy, a way to prevent a species that had lost its soul from destroying the entire world. Or perhaps that's just the lie they want me to believe to make the silence easier to swallow. Ask yourself, are you a citizen of the 21st century, or are you a squatter in a palace you've forgotten you own? What if the forbidden knowledge isn't about the past at all, but about the potential of the present? The investigation doesn't end here. It can't. Because the pattern is still moving. The institutional gatekeeping is failing. The erasure is being erased. I look out at the skyline and I don't see buildings anymore. I see monuments, I see tombstones, I see a call to wake up. Not this world, not that world, something else. The letter Thorn was told to burn is now a fire in my own mind, and fires have a way of spreading. What if the next great reset isn't theirs to control? What if the next time the mud clears, we are the ones standing there, remembering everything? The silence is ending, the stones are starting to speak, and they are saying that we were never meant to be this small. The silence in the aftermath of a revelation is not empty, it is heavy with the weight of institutional pressure. I returned to the brickwork in Manhattan, but the alleyway had been cordoned off by a private utility firm that didn't appear on any city register. Not this department, not that bureau, something else. They were injecting high-density foam into the very foundations I had photographed only weeks prior. It wasn't a repair, it was a burial. This is the physical manifestation of the erasure trope, the literal filling in of the gaps before the public can peer. Inside, ask yourself why a simple structural anomaly requires a specialized tactical team and a non-disclosure agreement for the local foreman. I watched from the shadows of a fire escape, feeling the staccato rhythm of my own heart against the cold iron. The ledger I had found, the one from the vanished firm of 1907, mentioned a sub-basement sigma. It wasn't a storage room, it was a terminal. I began to track the subterranean heat signatures across the 5 boroughs using thermal imaging equipment liberated from a decommissioned research lab. The results were intellectually provocative and deeply unsettling. There is a heat map of New York that doesn't correspond to the subway lines or the steam pipes. It follows the geometry of an older, more sophisticated grid. A grid that breathes. A grid that still carries a residual charge of etheric energy. The pseudo-academic gatekeepers tell us that heat rises, yet these pockets of thermal activity are concentrated 40 feet below the water table. Nature doesn't work that way. Physics doesn't work that way. Only a suppressed technology works that way. I travelled to the Philadelphia shipyards, seeking the connection between the 19th century ironclads and the supposed Philadelphia experiment of the mid-20th century. What if the experiment wasn't about invisibility, but about resyncing with the Tartarian frequency? What if the ship didn't disappear into another dimension, but merely slipped into the layer of time that the reset had paved over? The investigator in me sees the scars on the hull of the derelict vessels. They aren't from rust. They are from cavitation caused by high-frequency resonance, the same resonance described in the Thorn papers, the same resonance that turned the mud of the 1840s into a weapon of mass displacement. Consider the load distribution of our current reality. It is top-heavy, supported by a fragile pillar of lies that requires constant maintenance. The moment we stop believing the narrative, the pillar begins to crack. I found a second letter, hidden not in a book, but in the casing of a 19th century grandfather clock. It was written by Thorne's sister. She didn't tell him to burn his findings. She told him to hide them in the one place they would never look, the public architecture itself. The city of Washington, D.C. is a giant circuit board carved into the dirt of a swamp. We are told Pierre L'Enfant designed it in a fit of neoclassical inspiration. But look at the alignment. The streets don't just point to monuments, they point to the stars as they were 10,000 years ago. Not this era. Not that era. Something far more ancient. I stood at the centre of the National Mall and felt the hum beneath my boots. It isn't the hum of traffic. It is the low-frequency vibration of the granite obelisk acting as a resonator. Ask yourself why the Washington Monument has a different shade of stone halfway up. They tell us construction was interrupted by the Civil War and the lack of funds. But what if the interruption was the war itself? What if the war was a pretext to seize the site and modify the resonator? The institutional gatekeeping of the Smithsonian is legendary, but even they cannot hide the fact that the basement of the castle is built on top of a red glass pyramid. I spoke to a former night watchman who claimed he saw the red light pulsing during the summer solstice. He didn't call it a ghost, he called it a start-up sequence. The staccato sentence structure of his testimony was laced with a primal fear. He knew he wasn't looking at a museum. He was looking at a dormant power plant. I moved my investigation to the Great Lakes, where the sunken cities of the inland seas have been scrubbed from every modern bathymetric map. In the 1930s, divers found paved roads and stone arches at the bottom of Lake Michigan. Today, those areas are restricted military zones. Environmental protection, they say. Invasive species management, they claim. But why do you need sonar jamming buoys to protect a lake trout? What if the mud flood wasn't just a terrestrial event, but a hydraulic one? What if the lakes were created to drown the industrial heart of Tartaria? The contrast of scale is staggering. We see a lake, they see a lid. We see a park, they see a cap. We see a history book, they see a script. The investigative essayist must ask, who wrote the script and what happens when the actors start to ad-lib? I found a map in a private collection in Chicago that showed the Grand Canal of the West. It didn't connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. It connected the etheric hubs of the interior. It was a highway of light, and it was buried under millions of tons of silt during the 1850s. The Great Reset was not just a cultural shift, it was a terraforming project. They reshaped the face of the earth to hide the body of the empire. I followed the trail of the orphan trains to a small town in Nebraska that shouldn't exist. According to the census of 1880, it was a model city built with high vaulted ceilings and marble facades in the middle of a wilderness that hadn't even been cleared for farming. Where did the stone come from? Where did the glass come from? The local historical society, a textbook example of institutional gatekeeping, claims it was all brought in by rail. But the rail lines weren't completed until 5 years after the city was finished. Not this logic, not that logic, no logic at all. I interviewed a woman whose great-grandfather was one of the Reset children. He had arrived on a train with 60 other boys, all of them dressed in identical grey wool, all of them with their memories washed. He told her that before the train there was a great hospital where they played music that made them forget their names. Not medicine, not therapy, acoustic reprogramming. This is how you build a new world. You don't kill the survivors, you just make them forget who their parents were. You give them a new language, a new God, and a new job. You tell them they are pioneers, and they will spend their lives digging the mud out of the grand buildings they inherited, never realizing they are cleaning their own ancestral homes. The somber reality of the Midwest is that it is a vast, repurposed necropolis. The silos aren't for grain, they are the ventilation shafts for the cities below. The black blizzards of the Dust Bowl weren't just a drought. They were the result of the massive earth-moving operations required to finalize the burial of the Tartarian infrastructure. I found a technical term in a geological report from 1934, atmospheric silt loading. It wasn't natural, it was an industrial byproduct of the erasure. Ask yourself why the government paid farmers to plant trees in straight lines across the plains, to stop the wind, or to mark the boundaries of the subterranean sectors. The pattern is global. The methods are consistent. The result is a population of amnesiacs living in a world of wonders they believe they built with shovels and grit. The investigation took a darker turn in London. Beneath the foundations of the British Museum, there is a dead room where the artifacts that don't fit are kept. I didn't enter with a badge. I entered with a map provided by a disgruntled technician. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and old parchment. I saw the Vajra weapons of the East, kept in lead-lined boxes. These aren't ritual objects. They are electrodes. I saw the star maps of the southern hemisphere that show a second moon, not a myth, not a poetic flourish, a physical satellite that was decommissioned in the 14th century. The erasure trope is most effective when it targets the very sky above our heads. If you can hide a moon, you can hide a kingdom. I found a series of ledgers detailing the asset recovery of the 1860s. The British Empire wasn't expanding, it was scavenging. It was a global scavenger hunt for the remnants of the Tartarian etheric tech. Every colonial war was a tactical strike against a specific hub. The Opium Wars weren't about tea or drugs. They were about the resonant spires of the Forbidden City. The Sepoy Mutiny wasn't about greased cartridges. It was about the reclamation of the subterranean vaults of Delhi. The institutional gatekeeping of the empire is the ultimate sleight of hand. They made us believe they were the masters of the world because of their navy, when in reality they were just the ones who found the keys to the previous master's armory. The inquisitive mind must wonder, if they are the scavengers, who are we? We are the leftovers. We are the ones they didn't need for the recovery. We are the load distribution of a dying system. I found a photograph in the dead room of a man who looked exactly like Elias Thorne, standing next to a device that looked like a brass lotus. The photo was dated 1924. Thorne disappeared in 1888. This is the temporal stabilization. They don't just kill you, they move you. They recruit you into the very machine you were trying to expose. Not this life, not that life, a different life entirely. In the mountains of the Caucasus, I found the acoustic mirrors, huge stone bowls carved into the peaks, facing the stars. The official explanation is that they were early warning systems for aircraft, but they are thousands of years old. They are part of the planetary circuit. I met a hermit who spoke of the voice of the earth. He said the mirrors were used to listen to the Tartarian song, a frequency that kept the human heart in sync with the planet's magnetic field. When the spires were torn down, the song became a scream. Then it became silence. This is why we feel the tension. This is why the modern world feels unsettling. We are out of tune. We are living in a house where the power has been cut and the windows have been painted black. The intellectually provocative truth is that our mental health crisis is actually a resonance crisis. We are vibrating at the wrong frequency because the order of the compass has replaced the natural harmonics with the staccato noise of the industrial grid. I found a diagram in the hermit's cave, a diagram he had scratched into the stone with a piece of hematite. It showed the Earth as a series of concentric spheres, not a solid ball, a resonator. The mud flood was a phase shift, a way to change the resonance of the crust to make the old technology inert. Ask yourself why the most sacred sites in the world are all built on ley lines. They aren't magical paths. They are the transmission lines of the etheric grid. The cathedrals are the transformers. The obelisks are the antennas. And we are the ground. The somber realization is that we are being drained. The grid isn't providing energy to us. It is taking it from us. The Great Reset was the installation of a global parasite, a system that feeds on the creative energy of a forgotten civilization. The investigator in me wanted to tear down the mirrors, but the scholar in me knew that the mirrors are the only thing left that still listens. The rhythm of the search brought me back to the coast of California, to the star forts that dot the coastline. We are told they were built for coastal defense during the 18th and 19th centuries, but look at the geometry from above. They are fractals, they are mandalas, they are perfectly symmetrical star polygons that have no practical military application in an era of cannonballs and wooden ships. Not this defense. Not that defense, something else. These are not forts. They are earth batteries. They are the grounding points for the atmospheric energy collectors. I found a technical manual in the ruins of a fort near Monterey that described the saturation of the bastions. It spoke of filling the lower chambers with salt water to create a galvanic cell. The scale of the energy produced would have been enough to light a continent, and we are told they were for shooting at pirates. The erasure is so brazen it borders on the comedic. It is a conspiratorial joke played on a population that has lost the ability to see symmetry. I traced the alignment of the star forts across the globe. They are all connected. They form a pentagonal web that mirrors the magnetic field of the Earth. This is the Tartarian web, a global wireless power system that was operational until the mid-1800s. What if the Great Fire of San Francisco was triggered by a surge in this web? What if the earthquake was the result of a deliberate grounding of the Monterey battery? I found a letter in the archives of a defunct telegraph company. It was dated April 17th, 1906. One day before the quake. It said, "The sequence is initiated. The grid is being purged. Ensure the new lines are copper. The ether is no longer ours. Not an accident. Not a disaster. A hostile takeover of the energy supply." The order of the compass didn't just hide the past, they privatized the future. They took a free, universal resource and replaced it with a metered, taxable and controllable substitute. They turned us from masters of light into slaves of the wire. The pseudo-academic language used by history textbooks is a form of hypnotic suggestion. It uses words like inevitable, primitive, and evolution to make the loss of Tartaria seem like a natural progression. But there is nothing natural about the loss of free energy. There is nothing inevitable about the destruction of beautiful architecture. There is nothing evolutionary about the orphan trains. I went to the heart of the Rust Belt, where the empty factories of the 20th century stand like skeletons. I found that many of these factories were built on top of foundries that appear in no record. Foundries that could melt stone. Foundries that used the Tartarian glow to create materials we cannot replicate today. The load distribution of our industrial history is skewed. We are told we invented the steam engine, but I found drawings of steam-powered turbines in a 16th century monastery in Spain. We are told we invented the light bulb, but the eternal lamps of the Tartarian tombs have been burning for centuries without a single cord. The investigative essayist must confront the unsettling truth. We are a regressive species. We are moving backward, coached by a Chronos Bureau that tells us we are moving forward. Ask yourself why the Golden Age is always in the distant past in every culture's mythology. It's not a myth. It's a memory of Tartaria. It's a memory of a time before the Great Reset, before the mud, before the wires. I found a piece of Tartarian glass in a scrapyard in Detroit. It was warm to the touch. It had been pulled from the foundation of an old post office. When I held it to the sun, I didn't see the street. I saw a city of white stone and golden domes, shimmering in an air that didn't smell of exhaust. It was a frequency trap, a fragment of the old world's visual record, preserved in the molecular structure of the glass. The institutional gatekeeping wants that glass destroyed. They want the foundries levelled. They want the orphans to keep believing they are pioneers. The 10th part of the Thorn Papers was not a text at all. It was a series of coordinates and a single instruction. Look at the shadows. I went to the coordinates, a barren patch of desert in the American Southwest, at high noon on the spring equinox. There, in the middle of nothing, the shadow of a great spire appeared on the sand. There was no spire. There was nothing but air, but the shadow was solid. It was a light graft, a holographic remnant of a building that had been erased from the physical world, but remained in the etheric record. This is the ultimate historical mystery. The empire isn't gone. It's just out of phase. The Great Reset wasn't a physical destruction. It was a frequency shift that moved the Tartarian world 1 degree out of our perception. We are living in the same space as the giants, but we are vibrating at a different speed. We are like two radio stations broadcasting on the same frequency, but one is much louder and more discordant. The order of the compass are the ones who control the dial. They keep us tuned to the noise of scarcity, so we don't hear the music of abundance. The inquisitive, skeptical mind must ask, what happens if we change the dial? What if the investigation isn't about finding old papers, but about shifting our own internal resonance? The letter Thorn was told to burn was a blueprint for a resonance key, a way to tune the human heart back to the Tartarian frequency. If enough people did it, the curtain of ice and shadow would dissolve. The buildings would reappear. The energy would return. The institutional erasure would vanish like a bad dream. The somber, tense reality is that we are on the verge of a great awakening, that the authorities are trying to preempt with a new Great Reset. They are trying to move us even further away into a digital meta world where the stones can't reach us. The urban exploration of the future won't be in basements. It will be in the code. The philosophical open loop remains. Are we brave enough to turn the dial? Are we willing to lose the modern world to regain the golden one? The shadows are growing longer. The spire is waiting. Not this choice, not that choice, something else. The investigation is over. The invitation is now yours. Ask yourself, what if? The invitation, however, is not a passive thing. It is a haunting. To look at the shadows is to realize that the ground beneath our feet is a hollowed out history, a honeycomb of repurposed vaults and silenced machines. I returned to the coordinates in the southwest. not to watch the shadow again, but to measure the air. I used a simple handheld magnetometer and found that the desert floor was pulsing, not a geological pulse, not the slow heave of tectonic plates. It was a rhythmic, artificial beat, 60 cycles per second, perfectly stable, perfectly cold. Ask yourself why the most desolate places on our maps are the most heavily guarded by invisible fences. What if the nature preserves are actually history preserves, keeping us away from the places where the etheric grid is still active? I began to look for the ventilation points Thorne mentioned in his final unburned notes. He described them as cairns of the forgotten, stone piles that hikers assume are trail markers, but are actually atmospheric intakes for the world below. I found one near the Shadow Spire. It wasn't made of local sandstone. It was made of the same Gobi granite I had found in the Brooklyn basement. The stones were fitted together without mortar, so tightly that a razor blade couldn't pass between them. Load distribution on a scale that defies the wind. I placed my ear against the stone, and I didn't hear the wind. I heard the sound of a city, the distant clatter of life, the hum of high-speed transport, the chime of bells that sounded like pure silver. Not this reality, not that reality, something else. The institutional erasure has been so successful because it relies on our own sense of self-importance. We cannot conceive of a world more advanced than our own, so we dismiss the evidence as anomalous or ceremonial. We are the victims of our own linear vanity. The rhythm of the investigation then forced me to re-examine the concept of the Great Fire. I pulled the casualty lists from the Chicago fire of 1871 and the London fire of 1666. The numbers don't match the descriptions of the destruction. Thousands of buildings were levelled, yet the death tolls were strangely low, or, in some cases, entirely absent from the official record. It's the erasure trope in its most clinical form. The fires weren't meant to kill people. They were meant to kill the infrastructure. They were purge cycles. Look at the photographs of the ruins of Chicago. The marble columns are melted. Brick doesn't melt in a wood and pitch fire. It takes temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius to vitrify red clay. Ask yourself what kind of accident generates the heat of a blast furnace across 3 square miles. What if the fires were atmospheric? What if the free energy collectors were reversed, turned into weapons that focus the etheric charge of the sky onto the city itself? I found a report from a 19th century fire captain who described the flames as blue and soundless. He said the buildings didn't burn, they dissolved. This is the pseudo-academic gatekeeping at its peak, labelling a directed energy event as a cow kicking over a lantern. The contrast of scale between the lie and the reality is enough to induce vertigo. I traced the lineage of the insurance companies that rose to power immediately after these fires. They were the same. Families who funded the Kronos Bureau. They didn't just rebuild the cities, they redesigned them. They removed the wide boulevards that served as resonance channels and replaced them with the cramped, erratic grids we have today. They didn't just change the map, they changed the flow of human energy. They created friction where there was once flow. The staccato sentencing of the Thorne papers began to make sense as I entered the 11th room of his metaphorical palace. He wasn't just investigating Tartaria, he was investigating the institutional gatekeeping of our very biology. He suggested that the human pineal gland was once a receiver for the global frequency. He called it the etheric eye. What if the Great Reset involved more than just burying buildings? What if it involved the chemical calcification of our own internal antennas? I looked into the history of the public health initiatives of the late 19th century, the mandatory introduction of specific minerals into the water supply, the shift in the human diet from high resonance foods to low vibration grains. Not this health, not that health, a different biology entirely. I met a dissident biochemist in a basement in Zurich who showed me slides of modern brain tissue compared to samples recovered from a 1700s peat bog. The difference was startling. The ancient tissue had traces of a crystalline structure that we no longer possess, a natural superconductor. We are literally dimmed down. We are the lower wattage bulbs in a world designed for brilliance. The somber realization is that the forbidden knowledge isn't in a book. It's in our DNA. The letter Thorn was told to burn contained a sequence of tones, a vocal key. He claimed that if a human sang these tones in a specific architectural space, the calcification would shatter. I tried it in the basement of an old cathedral in Montreal. The moment the third tone left my throat, the darkness of the basement didn't just light up, it became transparent. I saw through the stone. I saw the massive copper coils beneath the floor. I saw the water rushing through the sub-basement sigma. And I saw them. The Watchers. They do not look like the monsters of our fiction. They look like the men in the portraits of the 1890s, stiff collars, cold eyes, and a sense of absolute unearned authority. They are the temporal stabilizers. They exist in the spaces between the resets, making sure the load distribution of history remains in their favor. They are the curators of our amnesia. When I saw them through the transparent stone, they weren't surprised. They were waiting. The inquisitive, skeptical mind must understand that the conspiracy isn't a secret society meeting in a room. It is a fundamental layer of our reality. It is the software that runs the hardware of our world. I ran. I didn't stop until I was 3 states away, but the unsettling feeling didn't leave. The staccato rhythm of my footsteps seemed to echo the tones I had sung. What if I hadn't escaped? What if the investigation itself is a scripted path designed to lead the seeker into a specific kind of trap? The intellectually provocative loop is this: does the truth set you free, or does it just make you a more interesting specimen for the archives? I found a third letter from Thorn, postmarked from a city that doesn't exist, Neo-Scythia. It was dated 10 years after his death. He wrote, "The walls are made of light, the people are made of memory. Do not come here, you are already here." This is the urban exploration of the soul. The realization that the Tartaria we are looking for is not under the mud, but behind the veil of our own perceptions. I moved the search to the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, the Crystal Palace, a building made entirely of glass and iron, covering 19 acres. We are told it was built in 9 months. Ask yourself the technical impossibility of that in an era of manual labour and horse-drawn carts. The glass alone would have required the entire production capacity of Europe for a decade, unless it wasn't built, unless it was unveiled. The Crystal Palace was a massive etheric battery, a transmitter of the universal spirit. They held the exhibition to drain the device before they dismantled it. They invited the public to touch the machines, to marvel at the industry, while the Order of the Compass was quietly siphoning the last of the world's free energy into their private vaults. The erasure trope is at its most elegant when it disguises a heist as a celebration. I found a diary of a gardener at the palace who complained that the plants grew 3 inches a day and that the air tasted like lightning. After the exhibition, the building was moved to Sydenham, where it conveniently burned down years later. Not a loss, a deletion. They are very good at deleting the evidence once it has served its purpose. The staccato rhythm of the modern age began the moment the Crystal Palace fell. The scarcity was enacted, the reset was complete. We were left with the scrap metal and the lies. I looked at the Space Needle in Seattle, the CN Tower in Toronto, the Eiffel Tower in Paris. They aren't monuments to progress. They are the replacement antennas. They are the low-frequency broadcasters that keep the etheric eye of humanity closed. They are the pacifiers of the species. The tension of the narrative now demands a confrontation with the institutional gatekeepers themselves. I went to a lecture by a prominent historian who specializes in 19th century urban development. I asked him about the mud flood windows in the local library. He gave me a rehearsed smile. He talked about aesthetic choices and sub-grade insulation. I asked him about the Gobi granite in New York. He stopped smiling. He told me that my line of questioning was not productive. He told me that revisionism is a dangerous path. Not this. Warning. Not that warning. A threat. I realized then that the gatekeepers are not just protecting the past. They are protecting their own existence. If Tartaria is real, their degrees are worthless. Their books are fiction. Their authority is a shadow. The somber truth is that our entire intellectual infrastructure is built on the burial mound of a superior world. We are the inheritors of a grand theft, and the scholars are the ones who laundered the stolen goods. I found a list of banned frequencies in a dusty radio technician's manual from the 1920s. These aren't frequencies that interfere with signals. They are frequencies that interfere with the narrative. They are the tones Thorne spoke of. They are the sounds that make the stone transparent. I am building a resonator now, a small portable device based on the Lotus design I saw in the dead room photograph. It's not about power, it's about sight. The investigator in me knows that the only way to end the erasure is to see what has been erased. The philosophical open loop is tightening. As I calibrate the device, I find myself wondering, if I succeed, what happens to the world I leave behind? If the curtain falls, does the modern world fall with it? Can the reset children handle the truth of their ancestry, or would the revelation be as destructive as the mud flood itself? The pseudo-academic world is a cage, but it is a comfortable one. It provides answers, it provides a timeline, it provides a sense of progress. Tartaria provides only questions. It provides a mysterious and unsettling depth that most people are not prepared to swim in. The letter Thorne was told to burn was an act of mercy, perhaps, or perhaps it was an act of cowardice. He feared the light, he feared the golden age, because it makes our current age look like the dark one. I am not afraid. I am tired of the shadows. I am tired of the staccato lies. I am going back to the coordinates. I am going to play the tones. I am going to find Neo-Scythia, not because I want to leave, but because I want to remember. The load distribution of history is about to shift. The institutional gatekeeping is about to find that some gates cannot be closed once they are seen. Ask yourself, are you ready to see the shadow disappear? Are you ready to hear the song? The investigative essayist is done writing. The urban explorer is stepping into the wall. The historical mystery is about to become a present-day reality. What if the Tartaria we find isn't a place of peace, but a place of waiting war? What if the first great reset was a seed fire that is about to expire. The tension is the only thing that is real. The conspiratorial whisper is the only thing that is true. The order of the compass is watching, but they are also listening. They are waiting for the first tone. They are waiting for the return of the light, and they are terrified because they know that a civilization built on a lie cannot survive the truth of its own foundation. The bricks are cracking. The mortar is failing. The red light is pulsing. Not this end, not that end, something else. The script is finished. The camera is rolling. The lights are coming up. And for the first time in 300 years, we are going to see exactly where we are standing. Ask yourself, what if the shadow is the only thing that was real? What if the light is the lie? The unresolved philosophical open loop is now yours to close.